and thank you all the volunteers. And especially want to thank Dean Melway, because the reason I'm here, I'm a chair of the Carleton Access Network, which is part of the READ Initiative, Dean's baby, the READ Initiative, and we've done a lot of stuff at Carleton over the last couple of years already to create greater awareness for accessibility for the entire Carleton community. In fact, just this week, we in honor of United Nations Day for people living with disabilities, we released a series of fully captioned videos of our entire course on how to create accessible websites and documents that's available free to everyone in the Carleton community, teachers, administrators, students, everyone. Is that right, Keith?
As long as you have the Carleton ID.
As long as you have a Carleton. So sign up for Carleton University today. So this is our first guest. Our first guest today on the panel will be Darren Cooney. Darren, where are you? Darren, nice to see you again. Darren's the manager of public education at the Directorate of Ontario. Comes in from Toronto, say whatever you'd like. Darren, actually, right off the bat, I know there's one pressing question we all have. We all want to know the answer to. And I'm writing the letters A-O-D-A on the wall here. And we'd like to know, how do you pronounce this?
Oh gosh, well technically, it is AODA. However, we were speaking a little bit earlier and I said if you pronounce it Aoda, Aoda, whatever, it's not like a marketing or a branding best practice, but I will meet you where you are and I will try not to flinch or twitch. I'll maintain my poker's face, I will smile, and I'll meet you where you are and I'll help everybody to understand just precisely what AODA is all about and what you need to do in your workplace.
Fair enough. So what does the brand book say? Help get the message out. How do you want us to pronounce it?
AODA.
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 All right,
Please and thank you.
Thank you. All right. AODA. So I'm super proud of my government. Born and bred in Ontario. Get to travel the world because of you guys, making it imperative to be accessible. But this is awesome. I live in a province where my government publishes a bag this cool. Have you seen these bags? Did you make a pack of these? This handouts?
I did not bring them, but I can get them to people if they want them. If you've seen Lululemon, Lululemon's got nothing on these bags. Check it out.
Michael designed these, right?
Michael Young, yes, our designer extraordinaire designer.
All right.
Yeah.
So you come from a province that has bags that we give out to the people of Ontario, telling them how awesome, how invaluable accessibility is. But what's the thing we want people to do with the bags now?
So we're having a little contest in our workplace for one of two things. So the reason why I just took a picture right now is one stream of our contest is take pictures of these bags out there in the universe. If you see somebody carrying one of these bags, take a picture of them. And technically, it is legal to take pictures of people in the public, incidentally. That's my broadcast journalism training from back in the day. Take pictures of the bags out there in the universe to see where they're circulating and see where you might find them. I took a couple of pictures of the bag earlier just sitting on the couch, believe it or not. Stream 2. If you've seen the Travelocity, I think it is, the garden gnome or Expedia garden gnome that travels around the world and people take pictures with the garden gnome. Well, we have stream 2. Take pictures with your Access On bag in new and interesting locations. So back in August, I got to take my Access On bag to Bermuda. And lo and behold, I found out that Bermuda has an organization called Windreach. So some of you might have heard of Windreach Farms here in Ontario. It's basically equestrian or horseback riding for people with disabilities. And little did I know that there was a sister Windreach farm in Bermuda. So I went out for a jog one day carrying my bag, sweating up and down hills in Bermuda, found Windreach Farm and took a picture with the bag in Bermuda on the sign for Windreach Farms. So what I'm basically saying is don't even bother entering that stream of the contest because I've got that locked up. But feel free to take a picture of these out in the universe.
Fantastic. And what do we do with the pictures when we get them?
Send them to me. Yeah.
So Darren, you're not a nerd, fair to say, and you're a room full of nerds today.
Earlier I said I was not a techie.
A techie.
I'm the non-techie on the panel
right.
here. Yeah.
Fair enough. And the thing is, but I gotta assume it's awesome for you to be doing a job where you get to urge people to do good every day in your world. And I know you're dealing with policy, and there's setbacks, and there's frustrations, and there's politics, but can you give us an example of a story the kind of story that's touched you that helps you get to work every morning when you know things aren't going to be so good?
Yep, absolutely. I guess for starters, I'll say that I've always been driven by that quotation, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? And so community service is something that's always driven me to volunteer and to take part in my community and to join the public service, the province of Ontario. So I'll give you one little example of AODA implementation. So the AODA and the regulations under the AODA are, well, we're talking a couple hundred pages long, legal requirements that could be as, we're taping this, right? So I'll choose my adjectives carefully. Could be as perhaps high level as you need to consider accessibility in procurement. Okay, so it's my job to help explain what that might look like. But I'll draw our attention and then I think back to one specific requirement that requires educators in the province of Ontario to be trained on accessible and inclusive course design and delivery. So basically, creating welcoming and accessible classrooms. And in my job, I get to help create the tools and resources to roll out something like that. So about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we launched a portal in collaboration with the Ontario Public School Boards Association to help school boards across the province, English, French, Catholic, public, and so on, to teach all of their teachers, all of their educational assistants and so on, anybody in the classroom, about accessible course design and delivery. And so the portal had two components. One component was really the professional development curriculum for these teachers, and then the other piece we thought, well, we're going to go a step further. We can do these PD things for teachers essentially, but what else could we do? And we thought, well, what if we could build accessibility and disability themes into the curriculum itself? So whether you're a kindergarten teacher, whether you're a grade 6 phys ed teacher, or I was going to say grade OAC, but OAC doesn't exist anymore, grade 12 creative writing teacher, how could you embed themes of disability, inclusion, and accessibility right into your curriculum? So we worked with teachers and school boards to actually develop resources so that that phys ed teacher would know how to embed parasport in their curriculum so that all kids of all abilities could take part in both parasport and able-bodied sport and so on. So we launched that portal, and then several months later I got a call from an old friend of mine from university who had gone into teaching. And she said, Darren, I just went through this professional development day all about accessibility. And she said, well, did you do that? I said, well, it was our team that did that, yes. And she said, thank you. Well, my daughter, Charlotte, has a disability. And this is the first time I've ever seen her reflected in the curriculum in the province of Ontario. And she was just touched. And her daughter, to see herself reflected in that curriculum. So to me, that was incredibly powerful to hear that impact with a dear friend. But also to know that this little girl is reflected in the curriculum, sees herself in the curriculum. How powerful is that? And so other students will also see that in the curriculum moving forward in the province of Ontario. And the children, they are our future. Right?
So that's awesome, Darren. So right here, Carleton University often claimed to be the most accessible school in Canada. What's the thing you think, if we could do one thing to make classroom experiences more AODA compliant, more WCAG compliant, how do you see that interpreted in a school like Carleton? What do we have to do to make that 2025 goal happen right here?
Two things. First of all, it's attitude. The biggest barrier to AODA implementation, or the biggest barrier to accessibility overall, is just attitudinal. So dispelling those myths, breaking through the stereotypes, kind of permeating that bubble of what accessibility is all about. It is, yes, it is door openers, it is ramps and elevators, but it's so much more. So I think that's the first piece. And then the second piece, bringing it back to the concept of this conference, is getting more and more educators comfortable and familiar with technology, and then how to use it in a way that's accessible and inclusive to everyone. So if you're designing course materials, you're not just scanning pages out of a textbook and throwing them up in an accessible PDF online. It's thinking about how do we design something that's accessible to all students.
It's a real challenge to how do you adapt WCAG to the classroom. Actually, this is a good segue for me to bring up our next guest, Denis. There you are, Denis. Good to see you. Do you know Denis Boudreau? He's been involved with standards in Quebec. He's been involved with W3C, including the WCAG standards, since over, I'd say 15 years now, Denis? You're based in Montreal, you work at the DQ.
Yeah, DQ Systems.
DQ, not being Dairy Queen.
Not Dairy Queen. Yeah.
DQ being, tell us about DQ for those people who don't know how to pronounce that word.
DQ Systems is an American company based in Arlington, Virginia, that provides consulting services in accessibility. So anything related to either training or assessments of the current state of a website, to anything related to consulting, really. So it goes from strategic support for organizations who want to integrate accessibility into their workflow, to just being able to figure out where they stand with regards to being compliant with a requirement.
How long have you been with them?
It'll up like almost 3 years now.
Okay. I know you love the idea of helping organizations make it how they roll, inject it into their process. What do you think the most important thing is that you help teach your clients in terms of how to make accessibility sustainable for them?
Good question. A lot of people tend to think that creating an accessible website or remediating your website so it becomes accessible is a developer's job. So it's something that you come in and you fix at the end of a project, for instance. So you build everything like you wanted, and then at the very end of it, you'll call somebody like me to do an assessment and tell you whether or not you met those goals. And hopefully, I'll just tell you to fix this and that will be good. And we've been seeing that for years. And every single time, the organization will have to face the fact that they think about accessibility too late in that process, and therefore there's only so much they can do. There's only so much they can retrofit. And most of the projects end up being pretty far from what they intended them to be in terms of compliance to a certain requirement, whether that's WCAG or AODA or SGQRI in Quebec.
Right.
So a lot of the work that I do with organizations is helping them understand how it's important for them to think about accessibility much earlier in that process, even to the point where we're talking about the creation process itself and developing business requirements, for instance. So from the very moment where you start thinking about creating something new on the web, you should think about accessibility as well, because it's going to impact some of your choices, some of the decisions that you make in terms of technology or in terms of the creative process itself. So
I couldn't agree with you more. We find it when our clients come to us at the 11th hour and say fix it, when we say, you couldn't choose a more expensive or least effective or more frustrating time to make an online product accessible.
Right.
And so you're saying build it in at the first strategic steps. Build it in right at the beginning of the project.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, but considering the example Darren gives us, where you have, let's say, a classroom or teaching materials, which the lines aren't that clear as to how you apply WCAG. AODA points to WCAG, to AA or similar, depending on who you are. It's very clear on the web, but it's got to be, we all got to admit, it's a bit of a square peg in a round hole. We try to apply that to PDF, we apply it to documents, Word documents, classroom experience, real-time, asynchronous, synchronous communications. How do you teach organizations who want to say, I understand we want to do the best we can, but we have to know what the minimum requirement is, and then we also have to know what the best practice is. How do you help them draw that line so they can be part of that revolution that Darren's saying, let's do it?
Well, a lot of that is interpretation. So what we often find in accessibility, and I'm sure everybody will relate to that, is that if you put, say, 10 people in a room, 10 accessibility experts in a room, they'll come up with 20 different opinions about the way to do these things. So it's very difficult to get to a point where everybody agrees on the best way to do one thing. So it's usually kind of pointless to try and teach people that this is the way to do this. For instance, PDF accessibility. There are a lot of things that can be done to make them accessible, and a lot of people will tend to think that in order to make your documents accessible, the teacher needs to know how to use Acrobat, for instance.
Yeah.
That could be one way to look at it, a much better way to look at it would be for the organization to build templates, say in Word or in InDesign, for instance, that are already built in with accessibility, and teach the teachers just the process to convert those documents into PDF. And then you can leverage all that good those good features that you put in your source documents into your final document.
So a lot of the accessibility is already built into the templates,
Right.
and it leaves a lot less for people to have to worry about accidentally breaking it or having to infuse it themselves.
Exactly, because there's only so much you can expect people to learn about accessibility, and so some of the mistakes that I've been making in the past, and I've learned that with the years, is that when we teach about accessibility, we tend to break it down into success criteria, for instance. And we'll spend the whole day talking about 1.1.1 for images or 2.4.1 for bypass blocks and all these things. And you break down your day into 61 little classes or little topics. And I found that it's really not that useful, ultimately, because people forget these things. And if you teach, so going back to your question, if you teach in a university setting, for instance, principles about accessibility, and you focus on ideas like being perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, and you make sure they understand what that means, they will eventually figure out or be more sensitive to different issues that they may create unknowingly otherwise.
Well, fair enough, and I'm all for people living and breathing it, but ultimately an organization is going to say, hey, we need a compliance statement by an expert that says this complies with 38 success criteria, and I got to know, have we done enough or not? People need that hard line, and then exceed it where they can, right?
Yeah, but then that goes back to this idea of interpretation. I might come in and tell you that the documents do meet those 38 success criteria from level A and AA. Somebody else might come in and tell you that they don't agree on one of them for one reason.
Okay, so in WCAG 2, is there one thing, if you could wave a magic, here's a magic wand. If you could wave a magic wand and fix or change or delete one thing from WCAG 2 that you find most frustrating, what would it be?
I think WCAG 2 did a lot of great things with regards to improving how we look at accessibility in general, as opposed to WCAG 1, for instance. So being technology agnostic, for instance, is a great thing. I think that there's a and I mean that very respectfully still. I think there's way too much emphasis being put on users that use screen readers, and not so much on other types of users. For instance, when you look at people that have a visual disability across the world, it's 285 million people, out of which 39 million are blind, likely to use a screen reader if they're on the web. There's 246 million people that have low vision. What do we have in WCAG that actually caters for the need of people with low vision? We have success criteria 1.4.4, which is about resizing text, and that's a AA success criterion. So we have almost 10 times as many people that have low vision, and that always run into situations on a website because when they need to resize their screen, they create an horizontal scroll bar at the bottom. And if any of you have tried to read content on a screen which is not wide enough, and you have to pan left and right, you just can't concentrate. Or your iPad, for instance. You just can't concentrate on reading that stuff. So not only do you have a disability with vision, so it's more difficult to read stuff, but it creates another disability for you because all that concentration that you need to have in order to do things makes it much more complicated. So for one, so I would have two things to sell instead of one because they're related. So the first one would be, why don't we have more success criteria that are tailored for the needs of people that have low vision as opposed to people that are using screen readers? And if we did that, then maybe we wouldn't be thinking about accessibility meaning screen readers, for instance, something we see all the time. And the other thing is, why is the single most important thing for low vision users on level AA instead of level single A? Because for a lot of people, especially in AODA's case, for most organizations here, where they needed to be meeting with level A on the January 1st of this year, will only need to be meeting AA by January 21st. January 1st of 2021.
Yeah.
So that means that for people or for organizations that are looking at this as a checklist and saying this is what I need to do in order to avoid being sued, they won't really pay attention to the needs of people with low vision before another, 6 years?
I mean, I'm the first to agree that when we design for the extremes, everyone benefits.
Exactly.
But at the same time, the vast majority of disability is temporary, or it's not the extreme cases of someone who hasn't seen since birth. All right. So Darren, well, if there was because you're dealing with this, and you've got people working on the policing side, though I know your focus, main message is, let's talk about what we can do rather than focus on the tricky stories. Is there a WCAG 2 rule that you find people most often are struggling with, justifying why do I have to follow that rule?
You know, I wouldn't even say it's a particular rule. For me, the people that I deal with most often are like the business owners, and who else would be responsible for AODA implementation? It might be the HR professionals and so on, because that's typically where AODA falls. So for me, it just comes to an even broader level. So, like, what is website accessibility? Like, how do you make a website accessible? What is WCAG? And for me, it's like, how do I find a way to discuss this in a way that helps somebody to understand how to make a website inclusive and accessible, give somebody enough information to then go to, ideally, their communications person, if they have one. A lot of organizations don't, or at least give them the comfort level, like enough about WCAG to be able to speak to, it could be like the firm that they've outsourced their web development to. But I like some of the points, like the being able to resize text. We get into some issues about what's appropriate for alt tags. And then I come from a communications background, so often the easiest place for us to start is just using plain language. And I come from government, right? So we're talking about acronyms, right? So
you just hit my pet peeve, which is that WCAG 2 plain language is a AAA requirement. And it blows me away. I think it should be a single A requirement.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Hey, listen, great time for Laurent to join us, I think, because we're about to, if I may, Laurent Goderre. I don't know if you know him. Laurent's been involved with, well, we're talking about an implementation of minimum standards. I think it's the most triumphant, best example in the history of humanity of an organization implementing accessibility standards, and that's our federal government of Canada, moving from Ontario now, nationally, our federal government, which implemented, first in the world, across the board, if it ain't accessible, it's coming offline, hardcore compliance, but in the early days it was tricky, and Laurent has been working with CLF and the Web Experience Toolkit since 2007, fair to say?
Yeah.
So, that's, you know, the thing, when I'm traveling, I'm talking about accessibility, one of my proudest stories is how our federal government has taken this crowdsourced, open source approach to getting everyone involved in creating a library that is the Web Experience Toolkit. And one of the first things I wanted to ask you was, you know, we talk about how the Web, it's not just federal government, it's not just provincial government, there's people from all over the planet helping build Web. So tell us a little bit about Web, but also could you tell us about how broad is how big is the room of people who are now making Web awesome?
The Web Experience Toolkit was kind of born out of necessity, and if you look at it really, the Jordan court case that found us guilty of a charter breach probably was one of the most instrumental thing in giving Web the momentum. It did exist before that. It was called the CLF template, CLF2 template. We had to find a way to work smarter, and we found that we were doing these things all over and over again. We saw people using third-party libraries. They want to share a widget, for example, on their page, and they would just pick the first one, and they would put no consideration. So logically, we wanted to put the best people together and vet them and improve on them. And that's something that took off in the latest version, version 4, where we're not just building things, we're taking existing solution and we're giving the full power to the Government of Canada, our full expertise in making them better, so you can use them as part of a framework which is already integrated and makes it easy to be accessible. But if you don't want to choose a framework, then you still get the benefit of our work in those plugins.
How many people have participated in strengthening the toolkit?
The toolkit is a tricky example in that regards, because over time, I would say about hundreds of people have contributed, and the thing that tends to happen is you take away maybe 50 or 60% of their work because you just deal with the accessibility part for them. Well, they'll fill that void that you've taken, and they'll work on more awesome stuff. So, but that means a tricky thing for us because we kind of lose resource, and we have to constantly fight this battle of getting people on board, and that involves reaching out to the provinces, the municipality. We have the City of Ottawa on it. We're in discussion with City of Niagara Falls, Hamilton. So the more people are on it, if everyone can contribute one or two resource, and then they learn from us, we learn from them, and then we just build this together.
So what's the number one programming challenge, development challenge you guys are facing right now? If you could snap, magic question, where's the wand? Who else can help? Give him the wand here. The wand, magic wand. If you could go tap and say one thing on your list, get solved, or this unconference today says, okay, we're on it, we'll have that done by 4 p.m. What would that thing be?
Well, because of the court challenge that we had to answer to this, we've been monitoring the accessibility, and we've seen some really significant improvement in that regards. But there's an area that's more difficult than everything, and it's a web application. And something that these two folks touched on is you can make an application super accessible, but if you can't use it, nobody's going to use it. So it's more than just accessibility. It's building services that people need and building them in an accessible way, and understanding the needs of those people and the context that they're using those services.
Yep.
Is there a particular WCAG success criterion that drives you mad the most?
As far as WCAG come, I don't think there's any. I think this is over time. At first, I was kind of upset of how lenient it was, and they would just not advocate the right way. They would accommodate for some weird ways, and but over time, I've come to understand why. But what I would change about WCAG is not its criteria. It is the process that W3C is working on WCAG, and that would be to adopt the same model of crowdsourcing. As the government of Canada, we rely on the sufficient techniques, because they're third party, and it's not us coming. So if we have to defend in court, it's not our own thing that we have to justify. They're posted on W3C, and W3C wasn't quite keen on this approach because they say, oh, they can be out of date. And our answer to that is, why don't we make sure that they stay up to date, and then having developers involved in the process of they're creating them, they're engaged, and they can really participate in web accessibility.
So you find yourself, you're trying to comply, you're saying, yeah, we're going to use sufficient technique G13 or H51, because you can easily defend it, there it is right in WCAG. But some of these techniques sound like they were written in 1997, and they're about, you know, even applied HTML5, etc. And you're saying, let's crowdsource more techniques. Let's find a way to say, let's add a few hundred more techniques that are more relevant, more doable, more testable.
And that would apply to what was suggested before, more success criterion, to have this discussion among all the professionals. And the W3C, we have to remember that they're a standard body. They're a very technical body. So they're kind of a victim of the same problem we have, where we're technical, and it's kind of hard to write at different levels. They write for technical people, but really there should be some different levels of where you enter WCAG. So, and they kind of did that with the principle, and that's bang on what Denis said, to approach WCAG, to start and understand the principle, and then drill down more and more. But we have to face this. It's a very intimidating document. So if there's something that could happen that it caters to the comms people, the tech people, and give them what they need in a user-friendly way, that would really benefit everyone.
That sounds awesome. Denis, you've worked as an expert with W3C. How realistic does that idea sound in terms of implementation? There's our answer.
A lot of things to say. First one is, I'm not sure it's realistic because the organization has a lot of history. So the process is something that's really important. So I have a hard time imagining that it could turn to a fully crowdsourced movement and have everything built that way. That being said, there is a process in place for anyone to submit a new technique if they want to, if they think of something new. The challenge might be that for a lot of people it's very intimidating to submit something to W3C. So even though the process is fully...
I find it very frustrating. I mean, like, you go into the document and there's spots, and I love the W3C, I love WCAG and all that's been done, and the volunteers who've done this. I have nothing but praise for them. But like some of the way things are named, so confusing. And you know, you're in the document and it says link to come, and link to come has been there for 4 years, or you know, and you're wondering, what do I have to do to give them that link, or to give them, or to update that technique so it's relevant to current programming practices? Like, how does it actually work?
By the way, there's still some people that like mailing lists. I think that probably is the biggest problem.
Yeah, well, like I said, there's history. I'll go back to what I was saying. It's there's a process in place. For instance, an example of this. And so the challenge is always on your own shoulders to demonstrate that something needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
For instance, 2 examples of this. So I was talking about resized text earlier. In the interpretation of WCAG, of Success Criteria 1.4.4 for resizing text, there's this idea that there's a problem with the terminology. So they're talking about zooming the page. So that was written before page zoom was integrated into the browsers. So back then, zooming the page meant resizing the text itself. Since every browser has implemented a way to just zoom everything, so everything changes size proportionally, they added something in the technique that says, or in the understanding 1.4.4 document, that pretty much says that if the page is being zoomed by an internal feature of the browser, then that meets the success criterion. So that pretty much killed it for people that needed text resize as opposed to page.
But on the other hand, we're claiming this is a device-independent standard.
It is, yeah.
So,
well, I mean, it is technology ultimately. So you have to use, you have to stay within the context of the technologies. So you will not find anything in those standards anymore that talks about how to use, like in the normative parts, I mean,
yeah.
like how to use alt text, for instance, or how to use, or when to use a title attribute, and when to use aria-label instead. So you won't find that in the normative parts. You'll find that in the techniques instead. So there was it was made on purpose that the technical part would be in the informative documents because we know that these things change. So it just gets to a point where you have no choice but to talk about the different technologies at some level. And I think that one of the problems that Laurent was mentioning is that when you take those different techniques and you turn them into requirements, then you lock yourself into specific technologies that may end up aging very poorly. So, for instance, again, when you look at so going back to that example of resizing text, because we've talked about that already. If you start looking at anything but the normative stuff in order to determine what is compliant or what is not, if you look at the success criterion itself, it just mentions stuff about text resizing. So if you look at that only, you would think, well, if you're resizing just your text, you're going to fail this. And pretty much most websites today will fail that if you just resize the text itself and not zoom in the whole page. But because of the information provided in the understanding document, which is meant to help you understand the success criterion, they're pretty much shortcutting themselves, purposely or not. You probably weren't aware of that when that happened. But by adding that third bullet into the examples of things that will make it successful, then they're opening it up to this idea of page zoom. So,
do you think that the committee wants people like the community in this room to be submitting potential improvements?
I think they do. I think they do.
How many people have tried to submit something to the committee in this room to try to get documents improved? I'm just interested.
Yeah,
Do you think there'll be a WCAG 3, Denis?
I'm hoping there will be something else. I'm kind of hoping there will be like a WCAG without a number.
Yeah.
I like the idea of HTML becoming a living document that just improves over time.
Because Laurent was mentioning the idea of crowdsourcing improvements.
Yeah.
And it's intriguing. And yet from a governance perspective, like Darren, you know, you're talking about how, you know, we want to stay on the positive thing and teach organizations to just do the right thing. But ultimately, someone wants to know, I'm going to get sued or not, if I do what? What do exactly I have to do?
Am I meeting the standards? Am I
Yeah.
there? Am I not? Well, actually, I can't really 100% tell you because some of these are subjective elements. And in my mind, turns to some of the broader questions too about like, how does government or a body like W3C really actually regulate or set standards in the area of technology and information communications? It's something I think government is grappling with. Like we look at WCAG and say, well, January 1st, 2014, you had to meet these standards. January 1st, 2021, you need to meet additional standards. Well, by then, we're fully expecting the technology will have changed, and maybe it'll be WCAG X. WCAG exclamation mark. Who knows what it'll be? Who knows what it'll be, and who knows what the technology will be to get us there. And I think about, you know, the big news story over the last few weeks, one of many, has been Uber. How does government regulate something like that? How does government regulate a new business model that relies on technology and is throwing things upside down? How do we respond quickly? And W3C is going through the same sorts of questions.
If I may, also one thing related to the process itself of submitting a new technique or a new idea is that you basically need to demonstrate the use case. So that's complicated to start with, to begin with. But it can be done. The idea is that if you're willing to spend hours and hours defending your point and trying to convince everyone around the table, you might just get it at some point. But it takes a lot of perseverance. And a lot of people just can't afford to spend all that time doing that stuff.
Well, especially Darren saying the number one question they have, or people are asking one-on-one questions, what's this all about? And here we as a community are saying, well, we have a lot of trouble explaining to you precisely what you actually have to do. You know, if there's a law that says a doorway has to be so many inches wide so a wheelchair can pass through it, I could pull out a tape measure, I get it. I may agree, I may disagree, but it's easy, right?
Yeah.
And you're saying, well, we the experts in the room can't quite agree on exactly what you need to do, but you do have to do it by a certain date. That's challenging.
It just happens to be a craft and not a science. We can't do much about that. I mean, it's very easy to determine that your doors need to be 36 inches wide, for instance. Nobody will argue with you as long as they're using the same measure tape as you are. But when it comes to interpretations on something that is as potentially abstract as discussing what users actually need, I mean, you can't put that in writing very specifically. You can't tell me, as a colorblind person, for instance, you can't tell me that these are the combinations that I need. You have no idea what I need, and my combinations will be very different from other people in the room that are colorblind.
Yeah.
We have different disabilities when it comes to that. So,
well, we can all agree on a minimum standard of an alternative that doesn't rely on color to communicate
yeah,
information.
some of these things can be done, yes.
And with the Quebec standard, which you've been involved in, I've been trying to get an English language version of that now. Does it exist yet?
You will never find one.
So, why doesn't it just say do what Ontario said? Why doesn't it just say WCAG 2 level AA? You know, why doesn't it just say that?
Next.
It kind of says that. Hopefully, the next time that's what we'll do, and that's partially my fault, I would say. Back then, when I'll try to make a story short with this. So, I was approached in 2006 to work on their standards, create something internally, mainly because at the time there wasn't anything in French. And the government being French-speaking, and, well, technically the province is bilingual, but you can hardly get services in English in most agencies or departments. It's mostly in French. So, so there is nothing in the Quebec government that forces any of those entities to provide English content publicly. If you ask for it, they'll have it translated for you, and hopefully they will keep it for the next person that asks for it. But they don't have to provide that information in English. So that's the reason. That's why you don't find anything in English to begin with. But going back to what I was saying, back then there wasn't anything in French, so we couldn't just say refer to W3C because the information is in English. So that didn't work. We had to write something. That was in 2006. So that was 2.5 years before WCAG 2.0 got adopted. So we were very much influenced by the direction it was going with principles and stuff like that. But it was still very much WCAG 1.0 at the time. So, and we already knew at that time that this idea of mapping WCAG and HTML was a mistake. Because we were having issues with PDF, for instance, and we just didn't have anything that catered for the actual technology needs of PDF documents. So we knew we needed to do something different. We knew WCAG 2 was going into a direction where it was technology agnostic, but we had to build something else. And because I'm French, I tend to think that I know stuff. I figured at the time that we were good enough to rewrite those things in French, and we would just nail it. And we sort of did, but a lot of these things, with experience, like reading those documents today, I would change about half the things that are in there, if not more, because HTML5 came in the meantime, and it just changed the landscape, really. So even though we were thinking we were doing something that was completely technology agnostic, we ended up doing a lot of things that were really related to HTML nonetheless. And the process in Quebec was also made with a group of 30 different organizations contributing to this. Most of these organizations represented by people that had no technical chops when it came to accessibility. They just didn't know that stuff. They were picking it up as we were going. And they all had their own agendas. So each of those organizations were concerned about something specific, whether it's video or data tables or anything. So they would speak really, really loud when we talked about those topics, and usually to say, let's not push that too hard because it's going to be difficult. So a lot of our time was spent just managing expectations and concerns and fears of different people and trying to come up with a consensus. So anybody who's worked in a larger group, in that case 30 people, who all have their own agendas, and you have to come to a point where everybody agrees on something, you will necessarily just start dropping things along the way just to get that adoption or that acceptance from everyone. So that's what the process was over about 3 years. Process very much like the one at ISO, which again is similar to W3C in that sense because it's represented by powers that be that have a lot of influence. When we think W3C, for instance, we have the open discussions that are happening in the mailing list and everything, but then there are all these other discussions and breakfast and golf games happening with Microsoft and HP and IBM and all these things where a lot of things are being decided behind our backs. So the result of what we're seeing, and sometimes maybe even the resistance we get from some people that makes no sense, is often something that is actually from the organization that stands behind the person that is representing that organization.
Yeah.
If anybody's followed stuff that went on with the development of HTML5, for instance, with Ian Nixon, who was working well, I think he still is working for Google. He was the main editor of HTML5 for a long time, and he's pretty much pushed back on everything related to accessibility for the longest time. And up until very recently, if you look at the accessibility of Google products, it pretty much sucked.
It's pretty spotty.
Yeah. So maybe there's a correlation between the fact that he was resisting some of these things. Maybe it's not just because he's stubborn to begin with, or really does think that he knows everything, but because maybe Google was saying, push back on some of these things because we're not just ready for those things yet. And we don't want to become into a situation where we might actually get sued because Gmail doesn't do this, or because our calendar doesn't do that. Maybe there's that also. But we never hear about that stuff because that happens behind the curtains.
I think we're all committed to WCAG being the global standard, especially folding in HTML5, folding in ARIA. With the United States, any month now, getting that bill through Congress that's going to make Section 508 finally point to WCAG 2. Do you think Quebec is going to also do the same and say, okay, we're simply going to point directly at WCAG 2 level AA for the government of Quebec?
I doubt it. I think that Quebec will eventually point to ISO 4500 as their golden standard. Because at the W3C's level, because it's an American, well, it's an international organization, but like almost 90% of the companies that are part of the membership are American, so therefore it's pretty much like an American consortium.
But the committee's full of Canadians.
Yeah, they are.
It is a big trap,
what is,
though.
yeah, what is the representation power of Quebec or Canada in the W3C? I wouldn't think it's that big. I know for a fact that a few years ago when we were talking with different companies like Microsoft and Adobe and all these guys to change some things in their software for the Quebec government, we had very polite responses and nothing else. Because, I mean, it's a market of 7 million people. Our government is like 70,000 people. It's the smallest American department has more employees than we have in our whole organization in Quebec. So we weigh nothing when it comes to these things. So, and again, everything needs to be in French. So as long as you don't have a formal, official version of WCAG 2.0 in French, you're not going to get adoption from the Quebec government. If ISO decides to translate all that information in French and provides it in French, then it would be the case. But at the moment, ISO 4500 is 2-page long. It pretty much says refer to WCAG. So until that happens, I think we'll start just writing our own stuff because we need to have something that can be adopted because that's just how it
Well,
works.
why not just write a solid French translation of WCAG 2?
But that just points back to my point.
It's
is
still
that
as long, well, just a second. If it's not adopted by W3C as being the official translation, then you can't do it. If you did, somebody like me would advocate really strongly to just adopt that, exactly like what AODA did, and just say adopt WCAG 2 level AA. Whether or not you take 124 and 125 within the scope is another discussion, but I think the best thing would be to do that, for sure.
All right.
We're just going to do that.
You know, in Ontario, bilingual province, we got lots of Francophone developers across the federal government. We got lots of Francophone developers. I think everyone really enjoy having an official French WCAG 2 version, and there is precedent for that. You know, Japanese and etc. You know, there are WCAG 2 translations. Hey, look, let me shift focus because we'll figure all these things out, no problem. I think looking ahead, if we go 10 years in the future, Laurent, I'd like your opinion on this. What changes, developments in assistive technologies do you think are going on that 10 years from now will render some of these issues trivial?
it's kind of funny because this is a discussion that I had with Derek over there, a couple events. Yeah, you, Derek. A lot of things in WCAG were done because the browser technology didn't support them. And if we talk about skip links being one of the best example, skip link is not a requirement, but is one of the easiest way to address
Bypass lock.
Yeah, bypass
Sure,
lock.
yeah.
I forgot the number, what it is. But really, should it really be the developers that come up with this, or because we have in, for example, other technologies such as ebook, you have ways to navigate to a document. You have ways to specify to do this kind of stuff, and as long as your document has the right markup, you don't have to provide something specific to that. So, and that's the beauty of WCAG and the WAI, but the maturity is not there yet. But WCAG is one component that has to reach in the middle with other standards that all have to work together to make the web accessible, and that being the UAAG, and which is the User Agent Accessibility Guidelines, and the UTAG, which is the User ATAG, which is Authoring Tool Accessibility Guideline. So when you have these three things working together, that's how you really reach accessibility. And WCAG on its own, without the browser, is completely useless. If you have all this cool markup that allows all these things, but the browser doesn't consume it, it's pointless. For HTML content, but the same is true for other things as well.
Treasury Board has its existing exemptions for things like captioning, audio description rules, and it's the same for Ontario. Darren, you know, the one asterisk there saying, you know, we have our exemptions regarding some of the multimedia rules. Do you think that changes in terms of, let's say, automated captioning are going to cause both governments to decide to lift, for instance, the ease up we've got on captions?
We don't have exemptions. We have a grace
Yeah.
period.
Yeah, fair
Yes,
enough.
very
You have
important
a-
to make the distinction. But that's something that's cool that, well, Google comes out with pretty interesting product. Google has this automatic caption in their product. Unfortunately, it's not very accurate, but if you could leverage this thing, yeah, it would really automate.
It's become so much easier in the last 2 years to start with automated caption as a base point and then clean them up and you've got awesome captions.
Exactly, and it's even better if you have a transcript, if it's a prepared presentation, and you just fix it as you go along.
Darren, do you see them changing
So
that,
I
lifting that?
think it's a really interesting question, and for a moment I'll just go public servant and say I cannot speculate on where the government would go in terms of its policy. However, we are
Would
very.
you like to speculate on that, Darren?
However, we are approaching the natural point in which we would do a review of our information and communication standards. And what we would do as part of that process is we would be talking to people in the field to understand what advances in technology had happened since the standards were first implemented. How are needs changing? How are the standards working? Are they effective? Are they ineffective? And we would really take a look at the forms of technology. So things that would have been much more complex, much more arduous in terms of person hours and in terms of understanding how to do it. Well, 3 years later, if the software exists to do this almost automatically, I think it would be intuitive that would be something that we would consider as, okay, this might be a place where we would make some modifications to the requirements. The challenge is we're always balancing in the way we do our policy development. The government plays a role, but really we've taken a step back in terms of the policy development, and we bring people to the table. 50% people with disabilities, 50% employers. So 50% people that stand to benefit from the standards, as well as 50% the people that need to implement them. So really, we'd be tossing these ideas and the stakeholder input and so on to this group for them to grapple with. And the people that implement would certainly have some things to say about that, and hopefully we'll be bringing those perspectives to the table.
You know, when you guys say that, I always think, well, wait a moment, we all benefit. I mean, when we design, and not just as users, but I actually believe that Ontario leading the world at this in terms of private sector, that we're creating a stronger business community. We're more internationally competitive because we're going to have websites that just work better than everyone else's. And aside from all of the social justice reasons for doing it, there's a huge opportunity for professionals in Ontario because we get better and better at this, and then as the whole world passes legislation such as we're leading here, people are coming to Ontario, developers and writers and designers and coders and strategists and saying, hey, how did you get this done? I know that's happening for us. We got the phone ringing off the hook. Do you actually make that part of your message to rooms like this and say, hey, what an opportunity, aside from the love, what an opportunity for business, for us here in Ontario?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about Michael Young, our designer, that, well, he did the fancy bag there, and he had learned a bit about accessibility as he went through his design program. He's a registered graphic designer, but having worked with us for several years, RGD certified, having worked with us for several years, he had thought about moving elsewhere, but he's really come to know and love universal design and accessibility as his niche, really, and he's learned more and more and more, and now he gets to go out and do speeches and workshops to teach other people about that. I just got an email this week from communications and an IT person within the Government of Ontario that has also adopted accessibility and wanted to know about how to promote that skill of herself within the government. So our government is about 65,000 people, give or take, and there are a lot of other large employers out there trying to figure out how to build accessibility in from the get-go, from the beginning of web development and document creation. And so this is a major selling, and I know we'll be talking about that later, the Florida experience as well. So this is I think a major selling feature for individuals with these skills. And I'm thrilled when I see people like gatherings like this, where people have adopted this and understand the benefits and the economic and the fiscal imperative. And I guess for curriculum across the board, I'd love to see that in every college in the province of Ontario. Heck,
Well,
Quebec,
Darren,
across the
I'd
country.
like to point out then something that I find an odd thing that seems out of alignment. We're really proud in Ontario that we're the only place on the planet that has a certification, accreditation for graphic designers. And yet, if I get that RGD after my name, I don't have to know squat about accessibility. It's not even in the examination. Shouldn't that be fixed? And shouldn't it be the same for developers? Certificates in this province, that you shouldn't be able to get a certificate saying you understand how to develop software unless some basic understanding of accessibility?
I'll make 2 points, and I think Laurent's got something to say too. I'm glad you asked that question. So we are partnering with the Registered Graphic Designers of Ontario to build more accessibility into their curriculum and into their certification process. I've hosted a couple of events with them and have more on the go, and they're producing a toolkit which I think will be launching imminently, targeted at their population, at their membership, but available more broadly. And so that's the one point. And the other point is we're slowly but surely, it's not part of our legislative mandate, but we're thinking of it as part of our strategic approach. We're targeting industry associations and regulatory bodies one by one to build partnerships with them, sometimes funded, sometimes non-funded. But how can you build accessibility into the professional development curriculum for these organizations? So I've spoken on webinars for the Certified General Accountants of Ontario. Why do we go to them? Well, because so many small businesses, that's how they learn about compliance. Like, are we complying with this law, that law, that law, that law? You go to your accountant, your bookkeeper. They're the ones that would tell you that. Back to the WCAG and the web accessibility front, we're engaging the Canadian Marketing Association. And so we're at a whole host of their events this year, and they're organizing a number of professional development activities for their membership. Again, accredited, you get your hours for this, and building accessibility at that level.
You get your education credits.
Your education credits, yeah. But to your point, I'd love to see it built in even earlier.
So, Laurent, if Paul Jackson was here, what would he say about this?
I don't know what he would say, but in Ottawa we were lucky because the federal employee is such a big hiring force here. I think the school system doesn't have a choice but to keep up to produce qualified students when they graduate. So it's kind of a demand and a supply and demand thing, where because so many new posters require this knowledge at the federal level, the schools don't have the choice to adapt and include that, because if they don't, their students are not hireable, and they will have a hard time attracting people to those programs because there will not be a lot of learning opportunity. And if we bring that to the provincial level of Ontario, if business now are required to do that, and then when business are hiring, because of that requirement, they have to put accessibility as part of the hiring process, Ontario College won't have a choice but to follow suit. It might take a while, but so that's a very interesting thing. And when I didn't know about this. I heard that on the radio a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it was a great timing for this conference. But this, to apply accessibility standard at business level, not just at government level, is going to change everything. And it really, like college in Quebec, Cégep, will have a choice. It won't just be the Cégep in Gatineau that will be teaching that, because they will understand it. This is coming.
So if I can just jump in for a second on this. When we started building the standard in Quebec, we had, I guess, the government talked about it quite a bit, and we had some responses from some colleges, Cégep, or whatever you guys call that, if you have the equivalent here. And some of them did integrate accessibility into their curriculum. Most just haven't really heard about it yet. And I think the big difference, and I think one of the things you guys did really, really well, is formally talking about financial penalties. that's really a huge driver. As much as I hate using the stick rather than the carrot on these things, a lot of the people that I talk to on a daily basis are motivated by accessibility because they're afraid of, because they read somewhere $100,000 a day. They read that. That's all they read. That's all they remember. But it really stuck with them. So people will be investing a lot of money, partly because that's actually a lot of money if they get a fine, but it's also very damaging to their brand. And people are starting to understand that. And that part we don't have in Quebec. In Quebec, we have the standard. It's a mandatory standard. Every government agency is supposed to do that, but we don't have any kind of measurement of what is being done.
Well, and in Quebec, it's only for government, whereas in Ontario, it's for private
Also,
sector.
yeah, so that's another
50
good thing.
employees
Here,
plus as
here
well.
it becomes a very cultural thing. Everybody needs to take care of that. In our case, the private sector still thinks that it's a government thing. They really don't need to bother with that. And they don't get that it's actually a lot of people we're talking about when we talk about accessibility, not just people with disabilities, but a lot of user groups as well.
Darren, Darren, are you allowed to tell us what's the biggest fine have actual fines been levied? And are you allowed to tell us what the biggest fine there's been? And
All right. You know what? I honestly, I don't know what the biggest one is because we were talking about carrot and stick. I'm carrot. As you might have guessed, I'm not stick. They leave stick at home. This is so angry. But I'm just joking. But I take that as, like I'm aware of what's going on in terms of the compliance and the enforcement. But I also and I'm aware of the penalties and so on. But I try not to get into that because I try to create the space where people can say, we haven't done anything. Where do we begin? Right? And for me, being so separate from the compliance side of things, that helps to create the space where that happens. But it is happening, and I will say the penalties are happening. We're just now approaching the end of our second kind of compliance cycle for the business sector. December 31st is a big deadline for any businesses that have 20 or more employees. So if any of you, so I'll go stick for just a moment, if any of you are working in a business in the province of Ontario that's provincially regulated, your business needs to file a compliance report with the province of Ontario by December the 31st. And if not, we're coming after you. And we are coming after a lot of people. We've been doing that after the first round of compliance reports. They were due back in 2012. This is now the second round, and we're gradually reaching more and more
every
businesses.
business and NGO in the province, or just ones of a certain size?
Every business or NGO with 20 or more employees. You need to be filing something called an accessibility compliance report. It's kind of like a tax return for accessibility. You need to be filing it with government by the 31st, and it tells us that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, essentially. And then after that, well, we're already doing audits and inspections and enforcement, but we'll be continuing to do that into the new year.
It's interesting because Ontario might be one of the first to implement this monitoring, but Ontario is not the first one to apply such fine at the private sector. In Australia, the Olympic Committee was found guilty, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. So Australia was the first place where the private sector was successfully sued and penalized.
And that was
for
based on
accessibility.
a human rights tribunal approach. And there have been cases in the United States as well where there have been lawsuits that people have lost and have received fines. However, what's unique about Ontario is that this is based on an act that's specifically about accessibility.
And I would like to see a collaboration between the Ontario, because we've done a lot of compliance at the federal level. So if we could collaborate on what is a good way to our specialty is obviously web, but how do we deal with the web part of a business? And since business are more and more web, the W3C has looked to us and our methodology, because it saves time. It's not always realistic to assess every single page. So we really would like more collaboration on our common goals and common problems.
Well, I've said that before and I'll say it again. What has accomplished with the Toolkit is internationally recognized as being incredibly awesome. I hear about it all the time from different people that are involved in accessibility in different countries that are looking at this. If they're involved with government, they mostly know about it. They want to either create something similar or they're very much inspired by that. And same thing happens in Quebec. And it's easier for us because it's actually provided, it's very close to the people that are here. But from what I'm hearing, an increasing number of people from different places around the world are getting in touch with you guys just to see what you've done and how you've actually managed to do that, because it really does make a big difference.
And it's so much more maturity because you've been at it for 15 years. Ontario is relatively new at how do you assess this. Or actually, Derek, you and I were hanging with the Norwegians, right? And they want to meet with the Ontarians and talk about how do we actually measure what we've done. Norway is the only other jurisdiction in the world that's actually passed a law that also applies to private sector. And they actually went AA on their private sector. So Norway's actually got tougher legislation in Ontario now, though they haven't passed their deadlines yet.
Yeah. Well, I've got a suitcase, so if there's a flight tonight,
Have you got other countries in the world who are coming to you, Darren, and saying, hey, how do you educate? How do you get this out there? How do you be the carrot? How can we be more like you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. Like when we started on this journey, we were looking out. The province was looking out to other jurisdictions around the world, and UK and Australia and different jurisdictions and so on. And so now, increasingly, they're coming to us. So Israel came to us, the United Kingdom came to us, and then closer to home, Manitoba, a couple of the maritime provinces, British Columbia. We've been in Quebec as well. So I think it's something we can all really be proud of, that the world is looking to Canada. The federal government, the provincial governments, the world is looking to Canada now for examples of what we did. And then they're taking that, and in this case, Norwegian example, building on that and going even further. So I think that's something really cool for all of us.
Hey, look, questions from the room. Does anyone want to run the microphone around the room and see if anyone wants to ask some questions to our panelists? This is actually a Dymo Braille labeler, but we'll pretend.
So this is a little out of left field, and I realize you guys might be all wet.
Sorry, who are you?
Oh,
and
I'm
where are you
Peter
from?
Timmis.
Yeah.
I make a few websites, but that's not my main job. My main job is making Excel tables. How do you feel about accessibility in Excel?
How do you feel about accessibility in Excel?
I feel good about it. I actually don't know much about accessibility in Excel. I don't think there is much about accessibility in Excel. There's always the default styles, for instance, that will convey some semantics when you convert that to another format. But there's not much else. I work with a couple of folks that are blind, and we use Excel all the time, and they manage to work through those documents. They actually prefer to work in Excel much more than in other formats for a lot of different things. So that's why I'm saying I feel good about it. I'm convinced that there could be a lot more that could be done. But right now, my blind colleagues, my blind friends, can keep up with us because of Excel. So that feels pretty good as a starting point. I unfortunately can't tell you some of the shortcomings because I'm not really aware of those things. But I think it could be a lot worse. So that's a start, I guess.
Thanks.
Actually, we've written a thing on how to make Excel accessible. Just email me and I'll the list of how to do it. It's actually pretty straightforward. Any other questions? There's got to be other questions. Any other answers? Anyone who wants to do that thing where you really have something to say, you're going to pretend it's a question?
He's inviting it. Wow.
From what I gather, I'm just thinking of, I was on the city's accessibility committee here for a couple of years before AODA was formed, and was thinking of joining the board of AODA early on, but I didn't have the time. I think some critics of the Ontario government and AODA would be quite shocked to hear what you were praising Ontario for. Is this just within the web domain that Ontario's a leader? Because to me it doesn't seem that that's what other disability activists are saying about AODA. Can you comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to give that one to you, Darren.
Okay.
Cover all four
You're
pillars.
sure, yeah. So here's the thing. I admit it's a long journey. There's further to go, and we're not there yet. And so when you're faced with the situation, so here's an example where in the web domain, somebody can't access a website. It's gobbledygook to them. And so therefore they can't access that business. Or physically speaking, if I'm from downtown Toronto, how many of the buildings, how many of the restaurants along Yonge Street are basically completely inaccessible? However, in order to make them accessible, they would basically have to gut them and combine two of them, and it would be hugely, hugely complex. So I get it, and so I absolutely understand the criticisms and can empathize with them. I can speak to also some of the places where Ontario is a leader, and we're starting to go in the right direction. So, for example, I'll just start with the notion of expanding these accessibility requirements to not only the public sector, but the private and not-for-profits. There are some jurisdictions there that have done that in various ways. The easy road that government has taken and governments can take is to look after themselves. So, public sector, municipalities, universities, schools, hospitals, and agencies. But we went beyond that to the private sector and the not-for-profits, and also mandated this accessibility reporting, this check-in mechanism. And again, it's still early days. The legislation was passed in 2005. We're just about reaching the halfway point, and really only the second compliance cycle for the business sector, so we've got a long ways to go, as compared to like the Ministry of Labor, the Ministry of the Environment, other regulatory ministries that have been around for decades. And I think a huge piece is advocates, community members, people like us speaking about accessibility. It is the law. It's the right thing to do, but it's not only that. It's the law, and it's what people have to do. We implemented training requirements, again, affecting the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. And this is something I'm pretty excited about. And it's not just the teachers. We've mandated that every employee in the province of Ontario that deals with customers, the public, your membership, and so on, needs to be trained on accessible customer service and how to interact and how to serve people with disabilities. So I understand some people might dismiss that and say that's not good enough, but for what that means to me is that millions of Ontarians across the province are having conversations about ability, about access, about being more inclusive. And they may not be to the advanced level that you would find in a room like this or in an advocacy group, but we're getting the conversation started. And I think about the ripple effect. And what's the number one barrier that most of us face? It's the attitudinal barrier. So you're getting people comfortable talking about things that perhaps we were uncomfortable talking about. I come from like an equity and a diversity background. Like a lot of us are really uncomfortable talking about equity issues, diversity issues. We're Canadians. We don't want to offend. We don't want to say the wrong thing. But when we don't say anything at all, we often don't do anything at all. So to me, it's pretty momentous that we've created this training requirement that's rippling across the province of Ontario. And then with additional layers on top, so that eventually every employee, every worker in the province of Ontario will be trained on accessibility in some way, shape, or form. So some pretty interesting things. And the world is starting to look to us to see how it's working, how we think it will work, and how it might be adapted elsewhere.
Thank you, Darren. Look, we've got, thank you. So we've got 90 seconds left. I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds for one last wish. If you could have anything change in the next 5 years in terms of accessibility in the information communication space, what would it be? Denis, you're first.
Okay. I wish we'd stop talking about accessibility, really, and started talking about user experience in general. Stop making that distinction between accessibility people with disabilities and other groups that we're trying to please with good design, and just think about inclusive design and stop making that distinction, because there's really no reason to do that. And
stop making the distinction between accessibility and usability.
Right, because I mean, yes, there's a consistent 18-20% of people that have a disability pretty much everywhere. And we're clearly not making that big of we're not being that successful at convincing people that this group is important, even though it is. But we're seeing people are getting older. Those people are impacted too. People are using mobile devices. Those people are impacted too. So we're seeing these things changing the landscape a little bit. So if we started thinking about inclusive user experience or something like that instead of accessibility, that would be great.
Great. Show of hands, how many people are willing to help Denis have his wish? Let's make accessibility and usability one. And fantastic. We're on it. Next, Laurent.
I'll get a
Next,
Kickstarter.
No. You're next. Go. 30 seconds, your number one wish?
Big shocker. I will concur with what Denis said, but my angle is slightly different, but it really goes in the same way. When I look at web accessibility, to me it's just a measure of quality. We have to be obsessed about the quality of what we put out there. So we can't look at accessibility as the only measure, because that becomes a pitfall. We have to look at the usability, accessibility, performance. We have to make sure that people using mobile device have a very good experience. It's all about looking at the whole product and having these multidisciplinary team that work together and are really obsessed about quality. So my wish is to make web better and make sure that all these disciplines join and stop competing and really just and cross-train and have these
Multidisciplinary
discussions.
quality.
Yeah.
How many are in? Multidisciplinary quality? All right. I mean, thank you, Laurent. Darren?
So I will concur as well. And say, I'll make the comparison to, I talked about customer service, training on accessible customer service. Well, what is good customer service to begin with? Accessible customer service is just plain old-fashioned good customer service. And I think about the same in terms of web accessibility, it's plain old-fashioned usability. So I would turn my mind to these little devices that we carry around non-stop, we sleep beside, I see people holding them in the washroom and so on. So I would turn my mind to these and what can we do in terms of, again, the universal design and building features that we might see as accessibility features that truly are universal features, voice to text and so on, other features into these little devices. To me, that's what I would like to see accelerated, and I'd also like to see them available from a government perspective as a public service as low cost as possible to users.
So inclusive mobile. Inclusive mobile, are we in?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Man, you guys don't have wish. Thank you so much. I wish to thank you both, all three of you, for